The well goes dry at 4 in the morning. No alarm, no warning light. The pump just stops pulling water and starts pulling air. The farmer knows the sound. Every farmer above the Ogallala Aquifer knows that sound. And when they hear it for the last time, they know exactly what it means for everything they were going to plant in spring. This is not a metaphor. This is not a projection. In parts of Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and the Texas Panhandle, it is already happening. The wells that have irrigated the same fields for 50 years are hitting rock. The saturated thickness, the vertical depth of water-bearing material that a pump can actually draw from, has dropped so low in the southern reaches of the Ogallala that the minimum extraction rate needed for large-scale irrigation is no longer achievable. The pump turns on. Nothing useful comes out. And the farm that depended on that well has to figure out, for the first time in a generation, what it grows without water. The answer is brutal, and the country that eats what that farm produces does not understand yet what the answer means. The Ogallala Aquifer is the hydrological backbone of the American food system. It stretches beneath roughly 174,000 square miles of the Great Plains, South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas. And it supplies approximately 30% of all groundwater used for irrigation in the United States. It supports roughly 1/5 of the country's total agricultural output. The beef, the corn, the wheat, the sorghum, the cotton that comes out of this region does not come from rainfall. The Great Plains does not get enough rainfall to grow what it grows. It gets it from the ground. From water that fell as rain and snow during the last ice age, infiltrated slowly into a geological formation of sand and gravel, and has been sitting there for tens of thousands of years, waiting. There is no mechanism to replace it at meaningful speed. The recharge rate in the Texas portion of the Ogallala is less than 1 inch per year. Farmers are extracting multiple feet annually. The math has never been complicated. The math has just never been fully reckoned with. Now it is being reckoned with. Farm by farm, well by well. Water levels in the Ogallala beneath Kansas have dropped an average of 28.2 feet since large-scale center pivot irrigation began in the mid-20th century. In Texas, where the aquifer runs under the Panhandle, water levels have dropped 44 feet. In the most heavily pumped zones of West Texas, individual well logs show declines of more than 265 feet. The Kansas Geological Survey has documented that more than 1/4 of the entire High Plains Aquifer beneath the state has already reached what hydrologists call the minimum threshold, the point at which the saturated thickness is too low to sustain the 200 gallons per minute extraction rate that large-scale irrigation requires. 1/4 of the aquifer. Gone for farming purposes. Irreversibly, within 50 years, the Kansas Geological Survey projects that almost half of the aquifer in southwest Kansas will reach that minimum threshold. Half. The New York Times spent months collecting data from tens of thousands of individual wells across the country for one of the most comprehensive examinations of groundwater depletion ever conducted. Their findings, 45% of wells nationwide, showed a statistically significant decline in water levels since 1980. 4 in 10 sites reached record low water levels within the past decade, and 2025 was the worst year on record. The first 3 months of 2026 were the driest first quarter in American history. As of this spring, more than 60% of the continental United States has been under moderate drought or worse conditions. The wells that were already struggling are now struggling harder. The aquifer that was already depleting is now depleting faster. And the farms that were already watching the pressure gauges with anxiety are watching them with something closer to despair. Kansas Governor Laura Kelly has said publicly that some communities above the Ogallala are just a generation away from running out of water. 1 generation. The children of the farmers who are still irrigating today may not be able to irrigate at all. So what happens then? That is the question nobody is asking loudly enough. Because the answer changes everything about what American food production looks like. Not in 100 years, in 20 to 30 years, in the southern Ogallala zones. In some areas, right now. The assumption that gets made in almost every agricultural planning model. The assumption embedded in federal farm policy, in university extension programs, in the county-level projections of what communities above the aquifer will do when the water runs out, is that irrigated farmland will transition smoothly to dryland farming. That the center pivot circles growing corn at 200 bushels, an acre under full irrigation, will become dryland wheat fields growing at slightly lower yields. And that the economy of the region will absorb the difference and continue. That assumption is wrong. Researchers at Kansas State University, Colorado State University, and West Texas A&M published a landmark analysis of exactly this transition. They mapped the projected irrigation losses across the entire Ogallala region at fine geographic resolution and tested whether the land losing irrigation was actually capable of supporting dryland crop production when the water was gone. The finding was not the one the planning models had assumed. Approximately 13% of the land area projected to lose irrigation is not suitable for dryland crop production at all. The soils are too sandy, too poor in organic matter, too dependent on supplemental moisture to sustain the root development and nutrient cycling that dryland crops require. When the irrigation stops on this land, it does not become a wheat field. It becomes pasture, or it becomes nothing. Wind erosion takes sandy, unprotected soils in the Texas Panhandle and western Kansas quickly when the crops stop holding the ground. The Dust Bowl was not a myth. It was a documented consequence of exactly this kind of land exposure under Great Plains wind conditions. And the land that can support dryland farming will produce a fraction of what it produced under irrigation. This is the number that should be in every conversation about the Ogallala transition, and is in almost none of them. A center pivot field growing corn under full irrigation in southwest Kansas produces approximately 180 to 220 bushels per acre in a good year. The same field, on the same soil, growing dryland grain sorghum, one of the most drought-tolerant crops viable in that climate, produces approximately 30 to 60 bushels per acre in a good rainfall year. In a dry year, yields collapse further. In a drought year, they fail entirely. The economic productivity of the land does not decline gradually as the water table drops. It falls off a cliff when the extraction rate crosses the minimum threshold and irrigated production is no longer possible. A farm producing $300,000 in annual corn revenue under irrigation does not become a farm producing $200,000 under dryland conditions. It becomes a farm producing $60,000 to $80,000 in a good year, with no ability to survive the drought years that the Great Plains delivers regularly. The farmer who borrowed money against irrigated production values, who financed equipment sized for irrigated yields, who built a business model on what irrigation made possible, that farmer cannot service the debt on dryland returns. The math does not work. This is already visible in the farm economics of the southern High Plains. Land values in areas where the aquifer has dropped below commercially viable pumping depths have declined sharply. Farms that operated on irrigated economics for 3 generations are being restructured. Parcels are being consolidated. Smaller operators who cannot absorb the revenue collapse are selling, often to larger agricultural entities that can convert the land to cattle pasture and operate at the margins that cattle grazing on marginal dryland can sustain. The agricultural density of the land does not remain. It thins. The output does not remain. It falls. And what falls with it is the town. That is the dimension of this crisis that does not appear in the agricultural statistics. The economic multiplier effect of irrigated farming in a rural Great Plains community is not abstract. Every dollar of irrigated crop revenue generates economic activity in the town that serves the farm. The equipment dealer, the agrochemical supplier, the grain elevator, the seed company, the fuel distributor, the calf that feeds the people who work for all of the above. When irrigated production contracts in a county, the multiplier runs in reverse. The equipment dealer loses customers. The grain elevator handles less volume. The fuel distributor services fewer trucks. The tax base that funds the school district shrinks. The school consolidates. The hospital loses the patient volume that makes certain services financially viable. The services disappear. The population that depended on those services relocates. In southwest Kansas alone, 2.6 million acres have already lost the groundwater resources necessary to sustain large-scale agriculture. Those acres did not produce a formal announcement. No one held a press conference when the wells crossed the minimum threshold. The land just quietly stopped being as productive as it was the year before. And the towns above those acres are already in the kind of demographic decline that happens when the economic foundation of a rural community is removed acre by acre. Sublet, Kansas. Liberal, Kansas. Ulysses, Kansas. These are not cities with alternative economic engines to fall back on. They are agricultural towns built around the assumption that the water beneath them would last long enough to be someone else's problem. It is not going to be someone else's problem. Kansas state law now requires all 5 groundwater management districts to submit formal action plans for addressing groundwater decline to state officials by July 1st, 2026. If those plans are not submitted or approved, the state will intervene directly for the first time in the history of Kansas groundwater management. The emergency is now being treated as one by the institutions that spent decades pretending it was manageable. Now consider the national food supply consequence. Because this is where the conversation always stops short and where the real stakes are. The Ogallala supplies water to farms producing roughly 20% of American agricultural output. The crops produced in this region are not specialty items. They are commodity staples. Corn that feeds livestock and becomes the feedstock for an enormous range of processed food products. Wheat that becomes bread, pasta, and baked goods. Beef cattle raised on High Plains feedlots that run on water-intensive alfalfa grown on irrigated fields. Sorghum and cotton. The caloric density of what the southern Ogallala region produces and the connectivity of that production to the national food supply chain means that a sustained regional scale contraction in output does not affect only the people who live above the aquifer. It affects feed prices for every livestock producer in the country. It affects grain commodity prices in every futures market. It affects the cost of every product that contains corn, wheat, or beef, which is an enormous portion of the American grocery store. There is no reserve supply sitting in a warehouse. There is no alternative domestic production region waiting to absorb the output gap. The irrigated Great Plains was built into the food system as a permanent fixture, not a temporary supplement. The supply chains, the processing infrastructure, the feedlots, the grain elevators, all of it was built around the assumption that the water would keep coming. The water is not going to keep coming. The import question. Can the United States simply buy more food from other countries as domestic production contracts? Is the one that optimists fall back on. And it misunderstands the scale of what is at risk. The United States is the world's largest exporter of corn and soybeans, a top 3 exporter of wheat and cotton, and a major global supplier of beef. When American agricultural production contracts, global commodity markets feel it. The import price that American consumers would pay for food in a world where the Ogallala has been significantly depleted is not a stable, affordable number. It is a number driven by global demand competing against a reduced domestic supply, in a world where water scarcity is not uniquely American. The countries that could theoretically supply more food to a depleted American market are running their own groundwater deficits. There is also what happens to the land itself. This is the part that most planning documents skip past, because it is uncomfortable and irreversible. When sandy, marginal soils that have been held in place for 50 years by continuous crop cover lose that cover. Because the irrigation is gone, and the dryland crop fails in a drought year, and the farmer cannot afford to replant, those soils become mobile. The wind picks them up. In the Texas Panhandle, in southwest Kansas, in the driest zones of the Ogallala's southern reach, the soil types are the same soil types that generated the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. The conditions that created the most severe agricultural environmental disaster in American history were not unusual atmospheric events. They were the predictable consequence of removing the vegetation that held marginal Great Plains soils in place under wind conditions that the region generates every year. The conservation practices developed after the 1930s, shelter belts, minimum tillage, cover cropping, help, they do not prevent the fundamental physics of exposed sandy soil in a wind corridor, and they cost money to implement and maintain. Farmers watching their revenue collapse as irrigation becomes uneconomical do not have surplus capital to invest in long-term soil conservation practices that do not generate immediate income. The federal government has programs designed to address pieces of this. The Conservation Reserve Program pays farmers to keep marginal lands out of production and in grass cover. USDA's Ogallala Aquifer program has brought together researchers from Kansas State, Texas A&M, Texas Tech, and West Texas A&M to develop and evaluate water management strategies and dryland cropping systems that could reduce withdrawals while maintaining some economic viability. These are real programs doing real work. They are also working at the margins of a problem that is advancing faster than the solutions are being deployed at scale. What American farming becomes when the last well goes dry in these counties is not a mystery. The data from the communities where the transition is already underway provides the picture. It becomes dryland grain and cattle at a fraction of the productivity. It becomes land consolidation into fewer, larger operations that can survive on thin margins that small family farms cannot. It becomes rural depopulation as the economic base of agricultural towns erodes below the threshold needed to maintain services. It becomes a food supply system that is structurally smaller in its domestic production capacity than it was in the previous generation. It becomes more dependent on rainfall patterns that the Great Plains cannot control, and more vulnerable to the drought years that the Great Plains has always produced and will always produce. The farmers above the Ogallala have known this was coming for longer than any of them are comfortable admitting. They have watched the water table drop on the same instruments their fathers watched it drop on, and made the same calculation their fathers made, that the water would last long enough to get through this year, and then next year's problem would be next year's. The problem is now arriving faster than the planning cycle assumed, faster than the children of the farmers who planted the first center pivot circles ever expected to see in their lifetimes. The pump stops pulling water at 4 in the morning. The sound it makes when it hits air instead of aquifer is the sound of the end of what American farming has been for 70 years in this part of the country. What comes after that is already being built in the counties where the wells crossed the threshold years ago. It is smaller, it is less certain, it produces less, and it feeds fewer people than what it replaced. That transition has already started. It did not wait for anyone to be ready.